And we're pleased to say hello from Washington to Sinan Ciddi, Senior Fellow at the Director of the Turkey Program at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's think tank. Welcome. Thank you for being with us on France 24.
Thank you for having me.
Let's begin with Gaza, because there's a lot to unpack with this board of peace. The good news is the attention that's being brought and the commitments that are pledged to help rebuild, to try to stabilize the situation. How serious does this plan for Gaza seem?
Well, there has been considerable amounts of uncertainty as to its future, simply because one thing, getting a ceasefire negotiated and implemented was a challenge at the very outset, just to stop the hostilities that were ongoing. But we've all been wondering, essentially, since the ceasefire was established and implemented, how would we essentially move on to the next phase, which is essentially disarmament of Hamas and essentially moving on with the potential for lasting peace. And right now, what we seem to have is a number of countries that are willing to essentially commit troops to this entity so that they can essentially participate in training the Palestinian police force, hopefully, and the underlying and most important aspect, disarming and disbanding Hamas, and to have a meaningful chance of peace and prosperity for Palestinian people with the Israelis going forward. But right now, all we know is there have been a number of countries, mainly from the Muslim world, that have essentially agreed to step up. But we don't know if Hamas will be essentially disarmed and disbanded.
And Hamas, which seems to be at times talking about disarmament, at times saying they want to keep their light weapons, at times saying they don't want to give up their weapons at all.
Right, and this is the essential problem, and all eyes are essentially on Washington to see if the administration here will take Hamas to task and demand that they essentially disarm and disband, which is the bare minimum conditions that Israel will be willing to accept in order for meaningful peace to go through, simply because if they don't, the whole reason why we had the war in Gaza against Hamas was essentially to stop another October 7 attack, or even worse, its patrons such as Iran from funding and mobilizing Hamas to continuously attack Israel, but also not just limited to Hamas, the other entities like Hezbollah and Lebanon. So if they don't, actually go forward with disarming and disbanding, I think we're likely to sort of run into deep trouble as far as this board of peace is concerned, simply because the Israeli government is probably not going to accept any conditions of withdrawing its military permanently from the agreed upon borders, simply because they continue to face an existential threat.
Many of those members of the Board of Peace supportive of a Palestinian state. Can they just ignore when we get almost daily remarks from members of Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet talking about annexation of the West Bank?
No, they can't ignore that. And these many of the Muslim countries that are contributing actual ground personnel or military personnel to the stabilization force, they run a very high risk here. The problem that they face is if you're a Muslim country contributing troops to Gaza, and then those troops will be required to essentially police and maintain law and order in this domain. The problem will be what happens if Hamas, that is refusing to disarm and disband, continues to mount terrorist attacks, and Muslim countries are essentially contributing troops to the stabilization force, have to police that. And if they do, and are perceived to be heavy-handed by their domestic populations with Hamas, that could have very negative political consequences for their home governments. And this is one of the inherent problems that we have. But you're also damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Who else is going to contribute troops to the stabilization force, but for countries who have a vested stake in the safety and security of Gaza going forward?
What do you make about the Europeans? There was criticism of this Board of Peace, saying it was basically a bid to undermine the United Nations. But then we see that among the nations on the list that were expected to be represented at the ceremony today, you have the likes of Italy, the Netherlands, Germany. Is this to placate the President of the United States? What is that about?
I mean, European criticism surrounding the United Nations is, understandable to a point, simply because they would like to see an international organization, the very body that was essentially enshrined and designed to guarantee collective peace and security since the end of World War II. But the problem with the United Nations is, and its various components such as UNRWA, which was designed to essentially handle and maintain and manage the plight of Palestinians. The problem with UNRWA and as an offshoot of UN is it has personnel and it has entities that are directly linked and have been directly linked to activities of Hamas. So it is being seen as an enabler of Hamas, and that has totally discredited the organization in the eyes of the Trump administration, as well as other international actors, and also not to mention Israel, which is the primary country which is trying to sort of essentially move beyond hostilities in this part of the world. So, the Europeans at some point, have to sort of, maintain two games at the same time. One is to sort of say, well, there are no international sort of overseers such as the UN over this. But the other problem that they have is their domestic public opinions, which don't understand and which don't perceive the very threat and existential threat that the region faces from Iranian proxies such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and other jihadist entities, which not only threatens the safety and security of Gaza going forward, but the entire region. And so, unfortunately, the UN is not essentially well poised to tackle this.
How were you looking at the family photo there while you're talking? Absent from that photo is Turkey's president. How does Recep Tayyip Erdogan feel about it all?
I think he's probably happy and unhappy at the same time. He sent his, envoy, the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, to attend this. And what's interesting about this is that Fidan is attending this and the family photo and the entire sort of meeting of this organization with his Israeli counterpart, Gideon Sa'ar. And so the Turkish diplomats have not essentially sort of crossed paths or been in the same room for a very long time now. So on the one hand, I think Erdogan is pretty happy that Turkey has a seat at the table and he's getting the media spotlight as a mediator, as a sort of primary Muslim country that has been involved in the Gaza peace plan. But on the other hand, I think he's deeply unhappy because Turkey has been denied, and I would say rightly so denied, contributing military presence, military troops into the stabilization force, which they've been very interested in. The reason they've been denied is because Turkey, amongst, if you want to call it European powers, but certainly NATO powers, is the only country which has mobilized, materially backed, and provided material support for Hamas. Now, we have many countries in the European Union that are concerned with Israeli actions and Israeli sort of managing of Gaza and the Palestinian question. But Turkey is the only member of NATO that is materially supporting Hamas as an entity.
Turkey,
which is problematic because
it's problematic, but Turkey's also perhaps the one country in the region, arguably, that has the know-how for rebuilding. It's got a huge construction industry, and if you want to rebuild Gaza fast, you need Turkey, don't you?
Certainly that's the case. Turkey does have a huge construction capability, but the problem is the Israelis have a red line, and they're saying, look, you cannot position a NATO military inside of Gaza that has called Hamas a resistance group and not a terrorist organization. And the problem, they say, if you put that military force in there, they're not going to essentially help with everybody else's sort of task to disarm and disband Hamas. In fact, Turkey's probably going to be in a position where they help Hamas rebuild and rearm. And if there are future hostilities between Israel and Hamas, the worry is, and I think Washington echoes this sentiment, that the worry is next time there is hostilities, that Hamas will have a NATO military standing shoulder to shoulder with them. And that's not going to be something that's acceptable either to Washington or to Israel.
And so just very briefly, you have this opening speech by Donald Trump at the inauguration. It's the Board of Peace, yet he seemed to be threatening war with Iran if they don't strike a deal within 10 days on the nuclear program. How's that going to land, not just with Turkey, but also the Gulf states who were well represented in the room?
Yeah, I think everybody's on edge for understandable reasons. Look, we know that there are many Gulf states in the Arab world, in the region, who have deeply problematic ties, deeply troubled ties with Iran. They're fully aware of the capabilities and the nefarious, I would say, intentions that the Iranian regime has had, and there are some states who have basically enabled and coddled the Iranian regime for some time. But the ones who have essential problems with Qatar, with Iran, the problem for them is this: they don't want a war and spillage and essentially instability in that region, even that they know that Iran's continuity as a regime in the region threatens their material interests, their economic interests, as well as regional security. But they don't seem to be able to understand what the consequences of military action taken against Iran would do. Would they be struck? Will their economies be destabilized? Would they have to take on refugees? Would they be essentially in the line of fire in this conflict if it does unfold? So the problem is uncertainty, and no state in the region wants to take that on. And it's not just the Gulf states. The Turks are essentially very worried about this too.
Sure. Sinan Ciddi, many thanks for joining us from Washington.
Thank you.